In 1932, the United States government launched a medical study to help poor black men in Alabama. That is what they told the men who enrolled. The study ran for 40 years. In 1947, a cure became available. The men were never told. They were never treated. The doctors running the study wanted to document what the disease did to the human body when left to run its course. That is one experiment. There are 3 more in this video. All of them real. All of them official. All of them conducted by governments on their own people. None of them are theories. The records are in public archives. Some of the apologies are on camera. What follows is what your government did when it decided you were more useful as a subject than as a citizen. There is a document that governs how medical research on humans is supposed to work. It is called the Belmont Report. It was published in 1979. Its 3 core principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Every principle in that document was written in direct response to something that had already happened. The rules were not created to prevent the experiments. They were created because the experiments had already been run. That is the first thing to understand. The framework that protects you today was written by people studying what had already been done to others. 1953, Washington, D.C. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency authorized a program that would run for 20 years. Its objective was to develop techniques for controlling human behavior, specifically to produce reliable confessions, to break resistance, to override a person's ability to refuse. The program was called MKUltra. It ran across more than 150 sub-projects. It involved at least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and at least 1 children's hospital. The subjects were not told they were part of an experiment. In many cases, they were not told anything at all. LSD was administered without consent. So were barbiturates, amphetamines, and mescaline. Subjects were subjected to prolonged sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and electroconvulsive therapy at levels far beyond clinical norms. 1 man died. Frank Olson, a CIA employee, was dosed with LSD without his knowledge. 9 days later, he fell from a 10th-floor window in New York. His death was ruled a suicide. His family spent decades disputing that. In 1973, the director of the CIA ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Most of them were destroyed. But a cache of approximately 20,000 documents had been misfiled in a financial records building and was never found by the destruction order. Those documents were discovered in 1977 during a Freedom of Information Act request. In August of 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner admitted the program's existence before the United States Senate. The program had run for 20 years, across 80 institutions, on people who had no idea they were subjects. But that is not the worst part of MKUltra. The worst part is a sub-project run by a psychiatrist named Ewen Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association at different points in his career. His patients came to him voluntarily, for depression, for anxiety, for grief. What he gave them was psychic driving, a technique he invented to erase existing personality patterns and replace them with new ones. Patients were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks. Electroconvulsive shocks were administered at up to 40 times the normal clinical dose. Recorded messages were played on loops for 16 to 22 hours a day. Many patients lost decades of memory. Some lost the ability to speak. Some lost basic motor function. They had come for help. They left with less of themselves than they arrived with. The Canadian government paid out $750,000 in settlements to survivors in 1992. 30 years after the experiments ended. Before we continue, leave a trace. Subscribe. Macon County, Alabama, 1932. The United States Public Health Service recruited 399 black men who had syphilis and 201 who did not. The men with syphilis were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term covering a range of conditions. They received free medical examinations, free meals on the days of testing, burial insurance. They did not receive treatment. The study was designed from the start to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men. The researchers wanted to document how the disease destroyed the body over time. In 1947, penicillin was established as the standard treatment for syphilis. It was effective, widely available, and cheap. The study continued for 25 more years without treating a single participant. When men in the study were drafted during World War II, the researchers contacted the draft board to ensure they would not receive treatment through military medical channels. They actively prevented the men from accessing a cure that existed. The study was finally ended in 1972, not by the government, by a whistleblower. Peter Buxton was a public health service employee who had been raising concerns internally since 1966. He was told the study would continue. In 1972, he passed documents to a journalist. The Washington Post published the story on July 26th. The study was shut down within days. By the time it ended, 28 men had died of syphilis. 100 had died of related complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. In May of 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. 5 of the original participants were still alive to hear it. The study ran from 1932 to 1972, 40 years. 193 government employees were involved at various stages. Not one of them stopped it from the inside. The doctor who led the program in its final years told journalists he saw nothing wrong with what had been done. 1950, San Francisco, California. For 6 days in September, United States Navy ships cruised slowly along the coast. They were equipped with spray nozzles. The nozzles were aimed at the city. The United States Army was conducting a test. They wanted to know how a biological weapon would disperse over a major American city if released by an enemy. To find out, they sprayed the city. The agent used was Serratia marcescens, a bacterium the military had classified as a harmless simulant. Within days of the test, 11 patients arrived at Stanford Hospital with a rare form of pneumonia caused by Serratia marcescens. The Army maintained for decades that the bacterium was harmless and that there was no connection between the test and the hospital admissions. The medical records of the patient who died tell a different story. Operation Sea Spray was not a one-time event. Between 1949 and 1969, the United States Army conducted more than 229 open-air biological tests over American cities. Minneapolis, St. Louis, New York City. In several cases, the tests were conducted specifically over low-income residential neighborhoods. No residents were informed. No health monitoring was conducted afterward. The documents confirming these tests were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act in 1976. The Army confirmed the program in congressional testimony in 1977. The residents of the neighborhoods tested upon were never informed. Not in 1950. Not in 1977. Not ever. Operation Sea Spray. Documented. Confirmed. The people who lived beneath those spray nozzles were never given the option to leave. The story is not over. Stay close. Subscribe. 1962. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. United States military vessels were conducting exercises. The sailors and soldiers on board believed they were participating in standard training operations. Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, was a series of tests run by the Department of Defense between 1962 and 1973. Its purpose was to test the vulnerability of military ships and personnel to chemical and biological weapon attacks. To conduct those tests, the Department of Defense used the personnel on board as unwitting subjects. Agents tested included VX nerve agent, sarin, and modified formulations of Agent Orange. Some tests used live agents. The men on those ships were exposed without their knowledge, without protective equipment, without any medical follow-up. The files were classified. The program's existence was not officially acknowledged until 2002. For 3 decades, veterans who had developed cancers, neurological disorders, and chronic respiratory conditions filed for benefits and were denied. Their files were classified. Their exposures were not in any record accessible to the Veterans Administration. A veteran named Wally Stark spent 30 years trying to understand why he was sick. In 2002, when the SHAD files were declassified, he discovered he had participated in at least 3 separate tests. He had never been told. His doctors had never been told. His benefits had been denied for 30 years because the evidence for his exposure did not officially exist. The Department of Defense opened a special medical assistance program for SHAD veterans in 2003. Wally Stark died in 2004. The Government Accountability Office documented his case in a report published in October of 2003. It is still accessible. It has been for over 20 years. The Government Accountability Office report on Project SHAD is still available online. It has been for over 20 years. The file number is GAO04159. For programs. For agencies. For different decades. Different institutions. Different methods. Different populations. One shared characteristic. In every case, the people conducting the experiment decided that the goal justified withholding information from the subjects, that the value of the data outweighed the right of the person to consent. That calculation was made by scientists, by doctors, by military officers, people with advanced degrees, professional ethics codes, people who knew the rules, people who, by any conventional measure, knew better. None of these programs required a conspiracy. No secret handshakes. No hidden orders. They required something more ordinary. A hierarchy that wanted results. A culture that rewarded compliance over objection. And the quiet assumption that the people being studied mattered less than the knowledge being gained. That is not a conspiracy. That is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is far harder to prosecute than a villain. There is a second pattern, one that connects all 4 beyond the obvious. In every single case, discovery came from outside. MKUltra was exposed by a misfiled box and a Freedom of Information Act request. Tuskegee was ended by an employee who spent 6 years being ignored before going to a journalist. Operation Sea Spray was revealed through documents obtained by journalists. Project SHAD stayed classified for 30 years until veterans and reporters forced it open. In not one of the 4 cases did the institution voluntarily stop or disclose what had been done. Every apology in this video came after the person it was intended for had already died. The Tuskegee apology came in 1997. The last infected wife died in 2009. The last known child with congenital syphilis died in 2004. The SHAD medical program opened in 2003. Wally Stark died in 2004. The Canadian government paid MKUltra victims in 1992. Cameron died in 1967. Most of the patients he treated never received acknowledgement. The timing of every recognition follows the same logic. Long enough after the fact that accountability is symbolic. Late enough that the institutions involved have restructured or retired the responsible individuals. The apology arrives when it is safe, not when it is owed. The Belmont Report. The document written in 1979 to govern medical research ethics. It was written directly in response to Tuskegee. Its 3 principles were not derived from philosophy. They were derived from failure. The populations chosen were consistently those with the least power to refuse or seek recourse. The Belmont Report calls that a justice problem. Every principle in that document is the photographic negative of something that was already done. The records referenced in this video are public. Senate testimony in the Congressional Archives. FOIA documents through the National Security Archive. The Belmont Report published by the Department of Health and Human Services. None of this requires trust in a source you cannot verify. The sources verify themselves. What remains after all of it is not a further revelation. It is a simpler question. The contract between you and your government says it will not use you. It says so in the Belmont Report, in the laws that followed Tuskegee. in the consent forms you sign at every hospital. Those protections were written after, not before. The question is not whether institutions are capable of this. The question is what conditions allow it to continue, and whether those conditions still exist. Subscribe. There is more buried.